Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling tenor clef on the bass,
Oh, yeah.
um, a challenge that I think a lot of bassists face,
Yeah.
whether you're getting ready for an orchestral audition or just wanting to expand your musical horizons.
Mhm.
We're going to try and equip you with the tools and strategies to make those notes on the page translate smoothly to your fingerboard.
Right.
And to help us unpack all of this, we've got our expert here,
Hey,
who is not only a whiz at tenor clef, but also a huge advocate for deliberate practice.
that's right. I'm happy to be here. Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about, kind of the history of, the bass and this kind of unique situation of reading an octave higher than the sounding pitch?
Well, yeah, it's really fascinating how the bass has this kind of historical quirk where we read an octave higher than the sounding pitch, similar to like how tuba music is written. And
Yeah.
it's more than just avoiding ledger lines.
Yeah.
It's a tradition that has been passed down for centuries.
Yeah, and then you add tenor clef on top of that, and it's like,
Oh,
it
yeah.
can feel like
It's a whole nother world.
learning a whole new language.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of bassists say that shifting into thumb position in tenor clef is
Hmm.
kind of a real stumbling block.
Absolutely.
So how do we make this process a little less intimidating and a lot more effective?
First, I think it's important to understand where tenor clef sits in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
It essentially sits between treble clef and bass clef, and you'll encounter it quite a bit in older orchestral and solo bass music.
Okay.
And so instead of just kind of throwing you into the deep end, let's break down a method that can help you decode tenor clef.
Okay.
And really, the key is to use what you already know about bass clef as a starting point.
Okay, that sounds promising.
All right, so
Some here.
imagine you see a note on the tenor clef staff
Okay.
before you even think about where that is on the bass clef.
Okay.
Visualize where that note would be in bass clef.
Okay.
Got it.
Got that image in my head.
Now, here's the trick. Take that visualized note and mentally bump it up one string on your bass.
Oh.
So if you visualized, say, a G on the D string in bass clef,
Okay.
in tenor clef, you'd play that same G on the A string.
Wow.
It's like a mental string shift.
That's actually pretty clever.
Yeah,
It's almost like using bass clef as a map to navigate tenor clef.
exactly.
Hey, I remember watching a cello video one time where the player recommended avoiding the A string altogether when practicing tenor clef
Yeah, no.
to force yourself to get comfortable with those thumb position shifts right away.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's a great way to build those essential skills from the get-go.
Yeah,
And this brings us to a really crucial point, which is how do we practice this effectively?
right.
And that's where the concept of deliberate practice comes in.
Okay.
It's not just about putting in the hours, it's about practicing smarter, not harder.
Okay, so when you say deliberate practice, is that just like a fancy term for focused practice?
It's
Because we all know we should be focused when we practice.
it's more than just focusing.
Okay.
Deliberate practice involves a very specific framework. Think of it as approaching your practice like a scientist conducting an experiment.
Oh,
You start with a very specific goal. Instead of just playing through a piece, you zero in on a targeted area for improvement.
so for example, like let's say I'm struggling with a particular shift
Yeah.
in a tenor clef passage.
Yes.
That would be my specific goal.
Right.
Nail that shift.
Exactly.
Pretty much.
Then you formulate a hypothesis about how you might improve. For example, you could hypothesize, if I practice this shift slowly with a metronome gradually increasing the speed, I will improve my accuracy and fluency. You're essentially setting up a testable prediction.
Okay, so I've got my goal, I've got my hypothesis.
Right.
What's the next step in this musical experiment?
The next step is to test your hypothesis through practice. And the key here is constant feedback recording yourself is an invaluable tool. It allows you to critically evaluate your performance and see if your hypothesis is working.
So if I'm watching myself play it back and I'm like, wow, those shifts are getting smoother and more accurate,
Yes,
then my hypothesis was correct.
exactly. You've collected evidence to support your approach.
Okay.
But if it's not working, you revise your hypothesis. Maybe you need to break down the shift into smaller movements or try different fingerings. It's all about analyzing the results and adjusting your approach based on what you observe.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It takes all the guesswork out of it. It's
Yeah.
about being intentional with every note that you play
Exactly.
and using that feedback to guide your progress.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah, it's about becoming your own practice detective.
oh, I like that.
So you
But
mentioned that shifting in thumb position is a common challenge in tenor clef.
where?
So let's kind of apply this deliberate practice framework and see how we can tackle that.
Okay, perfect. I'm ready to put on my detective hat.
All right,
What's our first clue?
well, let's look at a real-world example. There's a passage from Brahms' Symphony No. 4
Oh, yeah.
that's written in tenor clef
Bra.
and often trips up bass players.
Oh, yeah.
It involves some tricky string crossings and thumb position work.
Yeah, I think every bass player has a love-hate relationship with that excerpt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So your goal might be to play that passage smoothly and accurately at a specific tempo.
Okay.
Your hypothesis could be something like, if I practice the shifts slowly with a metronome focusing on relaxed hand position and precise finger placement, I will improve my fluency.
Okay. So I would practice it with the metronome record myself and then listen back to that recording and see if those shifts are indeed becoming smoother and more accurate.
Exactly.
And if not, then it's back to the drawing board to adjust my approach.
Precisely. You might try different fingerings, explore alternative bowings, or even break down the shifts into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Okay.
Remember, it's all about finding what works best for you.
This deliberate practice framework is really starting to make sense to me.
Good.
It feels very empowering to have a system for approaching these challenges.
Absolutely.
While we're on the topic of practice, I was curious about your thoughts on the 7-day practice schedule
Oh, yeah.
that bassist Tim Miller outlined for mastering tenor clef.
Yeah, Tim Miller's guide is fantastic. It's essentially a structured plan that incorporates many elements of deliberate practice.
Okay.
Each day focuses on a different aspect of tenor clef mastery, from intervals and scales to arpeggios and transcription.
I was particularly intrigued by the transcribing aspect.
Oh,
Do you think
yeah.
that's a valuable thing to do?
Absolutely. Transcribing forces you to really internalize the relationship between the notes on the page and their positions on the fingerboard.
Yeah.
It's like you're taking a deep dive into the language of tenor clef.
Right.
Plus, it helps to develop your ear training, which is crucial for any musician.
That reminds me of something I saw in a video about piano sight reading. And this pianist was talking about the importance of recognizing patterns in
Yeah.
music to kind of speed up that reading process.
Absolutely. Recognizing patterns is essential for efficient sight reading in any clef.
Yeah.
The idea is to learn to chunk musical information into larger units rather than reading note by note.
Okay.
So, for example, instead of seeing 4 individual 16th notes, you start to recognize them as a group, a rhythmic unit.
Right. It's like learning to read words instead of individual letters.
Exactly.
Okay. And so we can apply that to tenor clef as well
Absolutely.
by kind of analyzing common patterns that are found in tenor clef excerpts.
Right.
You can kind of improve your recognition and fluency.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
all about training your brain to see the bigger picture, and this ties back to deliberate practice. You can make pattern recognition a specific goal in your practice.
Okay.
Maybe you focus on identifying and mastering a particular rhythmic pattern that you often stumble over in tenor clef.
So we've got this deliberate practice framework.
Mm.
We've got Tim Miller's 7-day plan. We've got this emphasis on pattern recognition.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that you can think of that can help us conquer tenor clef?
Well, apart from those core strategies, there are a few additional tips that I think can make a big difference. Remember that cello video we talked about earlier where the player recommended avoiding the A string to force thumb position practice?
Oh, yeah.
That concept of pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone is crucial.
Right.
Don't just stick to the passages you're already good at. Seek out exercises and excerpts that specifically target your weaknesses.
Okay, that's good advice.
Yeah.
It's so easy to just practice the stuff that you're already good at.
Oh, yeah.
And kind of speaking of comfort zones,
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about your thoughts on alternative tunings.
Okay.
We briefly touched on bass tuned in fifths earlier.
Ah, yes. Tuning in fifths is a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
Instead of the traditional EADG tuning,
Right.
you tune the strings to CGDA,
Okay.
all in perfect fifths. It's an intriguing idea because it potentially aligns the fingerboard more naturally with the structure of tenor clef.
Do you think it would actually make it easier to read tenor clef?
Well, it's certainly worth exploring because the strings are tuned in fifths. The fingerboard patterns in tenor clef might become more consistent and predictable.
Yeah.
It could potentially simplify those tricky thumb position shifts as well.
So it's like the fingerboard is speaking the language of tenor clef more fluently?
Exactly.
But what about all the existing music that's written in standard tuning?
That's a key consideration. It's not just a matter of retuning your bass and magically becoming a tenor clef virtuoso.
Right.
You'd need to consider the implications for existing repertoire and orchestral playing.
Would you need like a specially designed instrument for that?
Potentially, yeah.
Or how would that affect intonation if
Yeah,
you're playing with other people?
exactly.
Right.
It's almost like thinking of it as a completely different instrument with its own set of possibilities and limitations.
Yeah. Maybe that's a deep dive for another day.
Definitely, it's a topic worthy of its own exploration. But for now, let's bring it back to our main focus, which is mastering tenor clef with deliberate practice.
Okay.
Remember, it's all about setting specific goals, formulating hypotheses, testing them through practice, and constantly evaluating your progress.
And don't forget those bonus tips.
Right.
Transcribe music, recognize patterns, practice writing ahead, and don't be afraid to push yourself beyond your comfort zone.
Exactly. And most importantly, be patient with yourself. Mastering tenor clef takes time and dedicated effort.
Yeah.
But with the right approach and a positive mindset, you can absolutely conquer this musical challenge.
So it sounds like the key to all this is really understanding what deliberate practice means and how to apply it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not just a buzzword. It's a powerful tool for any musician who wants to improve their skills.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into tenor clef and deliberate practice, what are some key takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with?
Well, first and foremost, remember that tenor clef is not an insurmountable obstacle. It's a challenge, yes, but with a structured approach and consistent effort, you can absolutely master it.
Yeah, I love that positive outlook.
Yeah.
What about the deliberate practice piece?
Right.
How can our listeners start applying that framework to their tenor clef journey today?
Well, start by identifying your specific weaknesses. Is it shifting in thumb position? Is it accurately reading ledger lines?
Right.
Once you know where you need to improve, you can set clear goals and tailor your practice accordingly.
And don't forget those hypotheses.
Right.
It's all about experimenting with different approaches and seeing what works best for you.
Exactly. Maybe you try practicing a tricky passage with different rhythms,
Oh, okay.
or experiment with various fingerings. The key is to be observant, analyze the results, and adjust your practice based on what you discover.
That makes a lot of sense. This
Uh-huh.
has been so insightful. I feel like I have a whole new arsenal of tools to kind of tackle those tenor clef challenges.
Good. I'm glad. And remember, the journey of learning tenor clef is an ongoing one. So embrace the challenges, be patient with yourself, and most importantly, have fun with it.
This deep dive has been a fantastic journey, and I hope you, the listener, are feeling inspired and ready to tackle those tenor clef challenges with a fresh perspective and a renewed sense of purpose.
And remember, this is just the beginning. The world of music is vast and endlessly fascinating. So keep exploring, keep practicing, and keep that passion for the bass burning bright.
That's a wrap on our deep dive into tenor clef and deliberate practice on the bass. We hope you've enjoyed the journey and gleaned some valuable insights to help you on your musical path. Until next time, happy practicing.